Have you ever wondered what happens when the thrill of a great deal turns into a nightmare you can't escape? Black Friday is supposed to be the ultimate shopping experience, a day of excitement, bargains, and maybe even a little chaos. But for some, it's the setting for events far darker than crowded aisles or long checkout lines. This story begins at a shopping mall in a quiet town, one that was usually peaceful except for the frenzy of Black Friday. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. Among the shoppers that day were three friends, Mia, Jake, and Lily. They weren't there just for deals, but for the adventure of it all. The challenge of scoring the best discounts had become their yearly tradition. This time, however, their usual fun was about to take a terrifying turn. The mall was packed, the kind of crowd that makes you feel like you're being swallowed by the sea. People were pushing and shoving, desperate to grab anything with a red tag. But as the friends moved deeper into the chaos, something felt off. It wasn't just the usual tension of shoppers fighting over electronics or toys. There was an eerie energy in the air, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jake was the first to notice it. As they walked through the electronics section, he saw a man standing completely still, almost blending into the shadows near the back wall. He wore an oversized hoodie, his face hidden, but something about him made Jake stop. The man wasn't looking at any products or rushing to snag a deal. Instead, he was staring, unblinking, directly at Jake. "Did you see that guy?" Jake whispered to Mia and Lily, trying to brush it off as nothing. But when he turned back, the man was gone. "Jake, it's Black Friday," Mia said, laughing nervously. "We're all a little paranoid. Let's just grab what we came for and get out of here." But Lily wasn't so sure. As they made their way to the checkout, she felt like someone was following them. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she thought she caught a glimpse of that same hoodie disappearing around a corner. The friends tried to ignore the growing unease, chalking it up to stress and exhaustion. But then the lights flickered. Just for a moment, the entire mall dimmed, and when they came back on, the crowd seemed different. Faces that once looked hurried and annoyed now appeared hollow and blank. "Okay, is it just me, or is something seriously wrong?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, a loud crash echoed through the mall, followed by a scream so chilling it stopped everyone in their tracks. The friends froze, their shopping bags suddenly feeling heavier in their hands. "Let's just leave," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. But as they turned toward the exit, the path they'd come from was no longer there. The mall seemed to have shifted, its layout warped like a maze designed to trap them. And somewhere, deep within the crowd, the man in the hoodie was watching. The friends stood frozen, staring at the unfamiliar hallways in front of them. The once busy mall had transformed into a strange and disorienting space. The cheerful holiday music playing earlier was now warped, the notes twisting into something that sounded almost sinister. The air felt colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on them. "This doesn't make sense," Mia muttered, her voice trembling. "We just came from that way. The entrance should be right there." Jake shook his head, trying to steady his breathing. "Maybe we took a wrong turn. Let's backtrack and try another way." Lily grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "No, something's wrong here. I don't think it's just us getting lost. Did you see how everyone just stopped moving? It's like they're frozen." She was right. The other shoppers, who moments ago had been rushing and arguing over discounted items, now stood eerily still. They were scattered around the mall, holding their carts or bags, but not a single one moved or spoke. It was as if time had stopped for them, but not for the three friends. "Hey," Jake called out to a man standing nearby. He wore a baseball cap and clutched a shopping bag in one hand. "Do you know where the exit is?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even blink. "Let's go," Mia urged, her voice cracking. "We can't stay here." The group started walking, moving quickly but unsure of where to go. Every corridor they turned into looked slightly different from what they remembered. Stores they'd passed earlier now had no signs, their windows dark and empty. Even the floor tiles seemed to change, shifting in color and pattern as they moved. "I don't understand," Mia said, panic rising in her chest. "How can a mall just change?" Jake didn't answer. He was too focused on the growing sound of footsteps behind them. At first, he thought it was just echoes, their own steps bouncing off the empty halls. But then he realized the rhythm didn't match theirs. Someone or something was following them. "Do you hear that?" Jake whispered. Lily turned around, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The footsteps stopped, but the uneasy feeling in her stomach didn't. "We're not alone," she said softly. They picked up their pace, their shoes squeaking against the polished floors. The sound of footsteps resumed, this time faster, matching their own. The friends didn't dare look back again. When they finally spotted a glowing EXIT sign ahead, relief washed over them. They sprinted toward it, their breaths ragged. But as they reached the door, it wouldn't budge. Jake shoved his shoulder against it, but it felt like trying to push a wall. "That's impossible," he shouted. Behind them, the footsteps stopped once more. A chill ran down their spines as they slowly turned around. Standing at the end of the corridor, partially hidden in shadow, was the man in the hoodie. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was staring directly at them, unmoving, but the faintest hint of a smile played on his lips. Jake reached for the metal door, his hand trembling as it wrapped around the cold handle. The low, guttural noise from behind it grew louder, almost rhythmic, like something breathing or worse, waiting. Mia and Lily stood close behind him, their faces pale and tense, each of them bracing for what might be on the other side. "Are you sure about this?" Mia whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jake hesitated, his grip tightening. "No, but standing here isn't an option either." With a sharp pull, the door creaked open, revealing a dark stairwell descending into the unknown. The air that wafted out was damp and heavy, carrying an earthy, metallic scent that made them all gag. The sound they'd heard before was clearer now, echoing up the concrete walls like a warning. "I don't like this," Lily said, taking a step back. "This isn't just some storage area. This feels wrong." "We have to keep moving," Jake said, trying to steady his voice. "If we stay out here, that guy might—" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing the man in the hoodie was no longer in the hallway. The space behind them was empty, the shadows eerily still. "Where did he go?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. Jake shook his head, unable to answer. All they could do now was move forward, even if it meant walking straight into whatever horror waited below. They stepped cautiously down the stairs, the sound of their footsteps amplified in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was growing thicker, weighing them down. The deeper they went, the more the light from the mall above faded, until they were plunged into near total darkness. "Do you hear that?" Lily whispered. They stopped, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but unmistakable soft whispers, like a dozen voices murmuring just out of reach. It was impossible to tell what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, desperate. "Keep going," Jake said, though his voice cracked. He didn't want to admit how terrified he was. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a narrow hallway lined with doors. Each one was slightly ajar, and from behind them came the same faint whispers, layered over each other like a chorus of fear. "Which way?" Mia asked, clutching Jake's arm tightly. Before he could answer, the door at the far end of the hallway slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. "I think it wants us to go that way," Lily said, her voice barely audible. "Or it's a trap," Jake replied. As they moved toward the closed door, the hallway seemed to stretch, the walls narrowing and the floor slanting slightly downward. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. When they finally reached the door, Jake placed his hand on it and froze. The cold metal vibrated under his palm, pulsing faintly, as though something on the other side was alive. "Whatever's in there," he said, his voice shaking. "We're about to find out." But just as he began to push it open, a piercing scream erupted from behind them, sending chills down their spines. They spun around, but the hallway was empty. The scream echoed endlessly, growing louder, filling their heads until it felt like it might split them apart. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, leaving them standing in the oppressive stillness, their hearts pounding in unison. Jake looked back at the door. It was now slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of red light spilling out from the crack. Whatever waited inside was no longer hiding. It was ready for them. Jake reached for the metal door, his hand trembling as it wrapped around the cold handle. The low, guttural noise from behind it grew louder, almost rhythmic, like something breathing or worse, waiting. Mia and Lily stood close behind him, their faces pale and tense, each of them bracing for what might be on the other side. "Are you sure about this?" Mia whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jake hesitated, his grip tightening. "No, but standing here isn't an option either." With a sharp pull, the door creaked open, revealing a dark stairwell descending into the unknown. The air that wafted out was damp and heavy, carrying an earthy, metallic scent that made them all gag. The sound they'd heard before was clearer now, echoing up the concrete walls like a warning. "I don't like this," Lily said, taking a step back. "This isn't just some storage area. This feels wrong." "We have to keep moving," Jake said, trying to steady his voice. "If we stay out here, that guy might—" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing the man in the hoodie was no longer in the hallway. The space behind them was empty, the shadows eerily still. "Where did he go?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. Jake shook his head, unable to answer. All they could do now was move forward, even if it meant walking straight into whatever horror waited below. They stepped cautiously down the stairs, the sound of their footsteps amplified in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was growing thicker, weighing them down. The deeper they went, the more the light from the mall above faded, until they were plunged into near total darkness. "Do you hear that?" Lily whispered. They stopped, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but unmistakable soft whispers, like a dozen voices murmuring just out of reach. It was impossible to tell what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, desperate. "Keep going," Jake said, though his voice cracked. He didn't want to admit how terrified he was. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a narrow hallway lined with doors. Each one was slightly ajar, and from behind them came the same faint whispers, layered over each other like a chorus of fear. "Which way?" Mia asked, clutching Jake's arm tightly. Before he could answer, the door at the far end of the hallway slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. "I think it wants us to go that way," Lily said, her voice barely audible. "Or it's a trap," Jake replied. As they moved toward the closed door, the hallway seemed to stretch, the walls narrowing and the floor slanting slightly downward. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. When they finally reached the door, Jake placed his hand on it and froze. The cold metal vibrated under his palm, pulsing faintly, as though something on the other side was alive. "Whatever's in there," he said, his voice shaking. "We're about to find out." But just as he began to push it open, a piercing scream erupted from behind them, sending chills down their spines. They spun around, but the hallway was empty. The scream echoed endlessly, growing louder, filling their heads until it felt like it might split them apart. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, leaving them standing in the oppressive stillness, their hearts pounding in unison. Jake looked back at the door. It was now slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of red light spilling out from the crack. Whatever waited inside was no longer hiding. It was ready for them. Jake hesitated, his hand hovering near the edge of the door as the faint red light flickered. The air around them seemed thicker now, heavy with something they couldn't see but could feel pressing against their skin. Mia clung to Lily, her eyes wide and darting to every corner, as though she expected something to leap out of the shadows. "We can't go in there," Mia said, her voice cracking. "That light, it's not normal. None of this is normal." Jake glanced back at her, his face pale but determined. "We don't have a choice. That scream, whatever it was, came from back there. We can't stay here, and we can't go back upstairs. This is it." Before anyone could argue, the door creaked open on its own, the faint red glow spilling out into the hallway and illuminating their terrified faces. The room beyond wasn't what they expected. Instead of a dark, ominous space, it looked like an ordinary break room. A table and chairs sat in the center, surrounded by vending machines and a coffee maker that seemed to hum faintly. But something was off. The walls were too clean, almost unnaturally so, and the red light didn't seem to have a source. It just was, bathing the room in its unsettling glow. Lily stepped in first, her hands clenched into fists. "It's just a room," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Maybe there's a way out from here," Jake followed, his eyes scanning every corner for something, anything that could explain what was happening. As Mia hesitated in the doorway, the door slammed shut behind her, making her jump. "Why does this place feel so wrong?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the table in the center of the room. A single piece of paper lay on it, folded neatly as though it had been left there just for them. He reached out and picked it up, unfolding it slowly. The words, written in a shaky, uneven hand, sent chills down his spine. "You're not the first. You won't be the last." "What does that mean?" Lily asked, her voice rising as she read over his shoulder. Before Jake could answer, the vending machines flickered to life, their lights blinking erratically. A deep, mechanical groan echoed through the room, and one by one, the machines began to dispense items. Candy bars, bags of chips, and soda cans spilled onto the floor, piling up as though the machines were emptying themselves in a frenzy. "That's not normal," Mia said, backing away toward the wall. The sound grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The hum of the coffee maker, the clinking of cans, the eerie groans, they all fell silent at once. Then came the second scream. This one wasn't distant. It was right there, in the room with them. The three spun around, but the room was empty. The sound hadn't come from outside. It had come from within the walls. Jake's breath quickened. We need to get out of here. Now. But as they turned to the door, the red light in the room began to pulse, growing brighter and dimmer in an uneven rhythm, like a heartbeat. The floor beneath their feet started to vibrate, and a low rumble filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. And then they saw it. A shadow, impossibly tall and jagged, started to form in the corner of the room, stretching across the walls like it was alive. It moved against the light, shifting and twisting as though it were watching them. The friends backed away, their fear reaching its peak as the shadow began to move toward them, slow but deliberate. They could feel its presence now, cold and suffocating, like it was draining the energy from the room and from them. Jake grabbed the door handle and pulled with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The shadow loomed closer, its edges flickering like flames. They were trapped, and whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Jake yanked on the door handle again, his palms slick with sweat, but it was like pulling against solid steel. The shadow moved closer, consuming the red light as it advanced. It was no longer just a dark figure, it seemed alive, pulsating with an energy that made the air crackle around them. Mia screamed, clutching Lily, who stood frozen, her wide eyes fixed on the shape as though it had her in a trance. "Help me," Jake shouted, his voice hoarse. He slammed his shoulder against the door, the impact reverberating through the small room, but it didn't even budge. Lily snapped out of her daze and ran to his side, her fingers fumbling to find a way to open the door. Mia stayed back, her back pressed to the wall as if she could somehow disappear into it. "It's getting closer," Mia cried, her voice cracking. Jake turned his head just enough to see the shadow stretch across the floor, its edges twisting and reaching toward them. The humming sound returned, low and guttural, vibrating deep in their chests. It felt like the shadow wasn't just approaching, it was pulling them in. Desperation took over. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the small multi-tool he always carried. He jammed it into the gap between the door and its frame, prying with all his strength. The door groaned, but still didn't move. Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth. Lily grabbed a chair from the table and swung it at the vending machines, hoping to create a distraction. The glass shattered, spilling chips and candy onto the floor, but the shadow didn't react. It was fixated on them, its amorphous form growing larger as it closed in. "We're running out of time," Mia shouted, her voice barely audible over the humming. Jake felt the door shift slightly, just enough to give him hope. He pushed harder, his muscles straining, and with one final shove, the door popped open. A gust of cold air rushed in, nearly knocking him off balance. "Go!" Jake yelled, holding the door open as Mia and Lily bolted through. He followed, slamming it shut behind him. They found themselves back in the stairwell, but something was different. The walls were darker, almost charred, and the air smelled of smoke and something metallic. They raced up the stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing like gunfire. The red glow seeped through the cracks in the door below, and the humming grew louder, vibrating through the walls. They reached the top, only to find the exit blocked by a heavy chain door handle. "No," Mia cried, tugging on the chain. Jake looked around frantically. The chain wasn't there when they first came down, and now it was as if they were being trapped on purpose. The red light seeped closer, glowing through the cracks of the stairwell door. Then, From above, they heard it, a faint, familiar sound. Laughter. Not just any laughter. It was the man in the hoodie. His voice echoed down the stairwell, chilling and mocking. Did you really think you could leave? They froze, looking up to see the man standing at the top of the stairs, his face still hidden by the shadows of his hood. He wasn't alone. Behind him, faint outlines of other figures began to materialize, their faces blurred and distorted like they didn't belong in this world. "What do you want?" Jake demanded, his voice shaking but defiant. The man tilted his head, his grin barely visible beneath the hood. "This isn't about what I want. It's about what you've already given." Before Jake could respond, the figures began to move down the stairs, their forms twisting unnaturally. The red light burst through the stairwell door below, flooding the space in its eerie glow, forcing them to choose between the advancing shadows above and the overwhelming darkness below. Mia screamed as the red light reached them, but instead of burning or blinding, it swallowed them whole. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and darkness, an endless void. Then, as if waking from a nightmare, they found themselves standing back in the mall. The lights were bright, the shoppers oblivious to their terror. The world seemed normal again, except for one thing. The red glow lingered in their peripheral vision, faint but constant, as though it had followed them back. Jake turned to Mia and Lily, his heart pounding. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. And as they looked around, the man in the hoodie stood in the distance, watching them, his grin wider than ever. Jake, Mia, and Lily stood frozen in the bustling mall, their breaths ragged, hearts racing. Around them, the normal chaos of Black Friday carried on. Shoppers pushed carts, loaded with boxes, kids tugged at their parents' sleeves, and holiday music played over the speakers. It was as if nothing had happened, but it had. Jake glanced over his shoulder, searching for the man in the hoodie, but he was gone. The faint red glow still lingered in the corners of their vision, a haunting reminder of what they'd just survived. "What just happened?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, trying to piece it all together. The stairwell, the shadow, the laughter, it felt too real to be a nightmare, yet too surreal to be explained. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice trembling. "But we're out. We're safe." Mia shook her head, clutching her arms as if she could still feel the cold from the shadow pressing against her skin. "Are we? Because it doesn't feel like it." Jake looked at her, then at Lily, and realized he felt it too, a sense of unease, like they'd escaped something only to step into something worse. But there was no time to dwell. They needed to leave. "Let's get out of here," Jake said firmly. "We'll figure it out later, but not here." They hurried through the crowd, weaving past families and overloaded carts, moving toward the exit as fast as they could without drawing attention. Each step felt heavier, like the mall itself didn't want them to leave. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the man in the hoodie to reappear, but he didn't. When they finally reached the parking lot, the cold air hit them like a slap. It was grounding, almost reassuring, but the sense of being watched didn't leave. "Do you think anyone else saw it?" Lily asked, her voice shaky. Jake shook his head. "No, I think it was just us." Mia turned to him, her eyes wide and desperate. "But why us? What did we do to deserve this?" Jake didn't have an answer. None of it made sense. The door, the shadow, the cryptic note. All he knew was that they were lucky to be alive. They climbed into Jake's car, locking the doors as soon as they were inside. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. As Jake started the car, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the speakers, followed by a faint, familiar laugh. The three of them froze, staring at the dashboard as the sound grew louder, then suddenly cut off. Jake turned off the radio, his hands trembling. He didn't say anything as he pulled out of the parking lot. They drove in silence, the mall growing smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. None of them noticed the faint red glow reflecting off the rear window, following them into the night, and none of them spoke about it again. Somewhere deep in the shadows of the now quiet mall, the man in the hoodie smiled. For him, the game had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more chilling tales, don't forget to tap the like button and leave a comment about your favorite moment. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join us for more unforgettable stories. Your support keeps this channel alive. Thank you for watching.